The storm didn't just flatten Rose, it peeled the land back. By morning, Eamon Pike's Southfield wore a fresh scar where red clay had slumped toward the irrigation ditch. The name on the deed was old and stubborn as fence wire, a relic from a man who died 2 owners ago, but the one standing in the grey hush, boots sinking into the soaked ridge, was Samuel Holt. He cupped a palm to shade his eyes, though the sky was a dull pewter, and squinted into the slump where the earth had caved. Clay and root and torn Johnson grass showed a hard curve beneath the smear of mud, not the right colour for rock, not the right shape for pipe. He stepped down the sliding face, every inch a slow bet against the slick, and pressed his gloved knuckles to the cold that pushed up from below. Metal, not a culvert, not a length of old plough blade. The curve tapered, like something meant to cradle a body. He climbed back up for the tractor, the old deer coughing awake, diesel breath steaming in the cold. The south field of his place, 320 acres of red clay and stubborn prairie on the edge of Coyote Bend, Texas, had taken the worst of the rain. From the road, it looked like the storm had dragged its knuckles straight across the topsoil. He bumped the tractor to the edge, careful with the bucket, careful with his angle, so he didn't tear more of the field than he had to, then climbed down again with a chain looped over his shoulder. Up close, the thing was exactly what his gut had said the first time his hand touched it. A metal coffin, long and narrow, the lid pressed with a shallow pattern of vines and stars so worn by time they were more suggestion than design. 3 letters sat near the crown, sunk in with a steady hand a lifetime ago. HCW. He hooked the chain and eased the bucket up until the weight pulled free with a sound that wasn't quite a groan and wasn't quite a sigh. Roots had laced its sides. Clay had mapped itself over every seam. For a second, the whole mess hung there, dripping strings of red mud back into the cut, and he could feel that old piece of his brain that the Navy had sharpened. Measure, secure, move. He hauled it slow to the equipment shed, rolled the door, settled the iron on a pair of pallets with the forklift tines and stepped back. In the dim, the lid's lines showed cleaner, the initials a little clearer. He stood with his hands on his hips, breath loud in the tin echo, and tried to decide whether to fetch the grinder or to leave the whole damned thing alone until the ground dried and he could pretend it had just been an odd coil of pipe. He'd lived alone a long time. Men in town said he liked it that way. He didn't argue. The place had belonged to his grandfather once, then his father, then him. His people were clay and wire people, not talkers. Men who fixed their own fences and changed their own belts and made do with what didn't break. He'd done a lot that didn't look like farming, too. Machinist mate on the Reagan when he was young, hands in engines that shook like sleeping bulls. Years after that, welding and maintenance across the panhandle, when the price of feed told him cows could feed themselves somewhere else. The farm was what stuck, the quiet, the habit of it, the way you could hear the wind when it was still miles off by what it did to trees on the rim of the world. He set the grinder on the bench and pulled the guards. The bolts along the coffin's lip had fused until the heads looked like blunted teeth, each one packed with clay and a rind of rust. He wiped them with diesel and a rag, then wiped them again, and even that small act felt like crossing a line. Sparks kicked bright in the cool shed as the wheel bit, orange bursts scattering at the concrete with little dying lights. The smell woke old places in him. Metal shiver, burned grit, the sting in the back of the throat that said something strong was being undone. The first bolt came grudging and then snapped with a report that bounced in the rafters and sent 2 sparrows off the crossbeam. He laughed once at himself, fast, quiet, then set to work. By noon, he had 5 of them free. The 6th was married to the lip like it had been poured on purpose. He got the right angle on the chisel at last and hammered, the blow ringing in the long tin room, his shoulders alive with that slow, steady hurt that's less pain than a reminder that everything still works, if you ask it right. He rocked back, arms burning, shirt stuck to his spine, even though the air was cold and damp, and wiped his forehead on his sleeve. Outside, the windmill turned slow. The rain had given up, but the clouds had decided to keep the sun to themselves another day. He went at the last bolt until the grinder's pitch changed. The head popped like a tooth, and the lid shifted a fraction, a sound like a drawer that hasn't been opened since a man last paid cash for coffee. He stood with both hands on the cold metal, feeling the hum of his own blood in his palms, then slid the pry bar under the lip and lifted. The breath that came out when the seal broke was stale and dry as old paper. He told himself not to think what he was about to see, because men who think at the wrong time see ghosts, and he'd had enough of ghosts. He expected bones. He expected a long, long moment of not looking, and then making himself look. Because once a thing is true, it's true whether a man's eyes are on it or not. But the space inside the iron wasn't lined with a man. It was packed neat with parcels. Oilcloth wrapped and strapped with leather that had blackened into something like shell but still held. Small chests with brass corners gone green. A leather tube for maps lying along the side. He pulled one of the bundles closer with a flat bar, gentled it to the edge, and eased it into his hands. The cloth cracked when he peeled it back and then gave. Coins answered the dim light like they'd been starved for it. Old faces and wreaths raised up in the metal, dates from a century and a half ago, an age you could read in numbers right there in his palm. He set the small chest down and opened it. The hinge resisted. The lid lifted. There were more coins, thin ingots stacked like slices of bread, a brooch set with stones that drank the light, silver spoons with family crests, whose lines were so fine he had to squint to see them. He reached for the map tube, and a strap snapped. A stiff roll of brittle paper slid partly free. He saw lines and notations and a careful hand. He didn't tug it. There were two things he'd learned that always stuck with him. Machines don't forgive rush, and history is a kind of machine that breaks easy. In the corner, half under a fold of cloth the color of old smoke, he found a locket. The chain had rusted to nothing. The case had the kind of hinge you'd expect to fail but didn't. He worked it open with his thumb and saw not a face, no miniature portrait to fix the whole lifetime in front of him, with eyes from another century, but a tiny compass, rose-etched in enamel, a delicate north held by a hairline needle that must have been glued down at some point because it didn't move, and on the back, an inscription that stopped him in place so completely he forgot to breathe for a second. To IH, my steadfast hand in the storm. He said the letters out loud and listened to the sound of it in the shed, like he was saying a prayer he remembered from when he was 6 and sitting on a church bench he couldn't wiggle on. IH Isaac Holt. His grandfather had used that name like a key when he told stories on summer nights under the bare bulb out back. The old man would lean in his chair and say Isaac steered more than cattle once upon a time, that he knew where the shallow crossings were in rivers and in men, that he was a courier in a war that wanted to grind people into what they weren't. Sam had been a boy, and boys sought truth with what holds their attention best. He'd believed the shape of it, and let the details get lost. He closed the locket and felt the small, exact weight of it in his palm. The initials on the lid weighted the way letters weight on a stone when a man has walked past a grave and stopped because something asked him to. HCW. He spoke those too, but they didn't hook anything in him. He went for a brush and a rag, wiped the lip clean, and traced the worn scrollwork with 2 fingers. Vines and a star. He could make out the ghost of a circle like a seal on the crown, 4 tiny quadrants inside, but time had eaten it down to suggestion. He wrapped the parcels back, not to hide them, but to give them back the order someone else had meant. He shut the lid without bolting it, and pulled the tarp over the lot and latched the big door from the inside. He stood in the dim with one strip of light working through the gap near the floor and listened to his own breath until it evened. Then he pocketed the locket and stepped out into the cold, closing the padlock on the shed from the outside and turning the shank twice to make sure. He could have called then. He thought about the deputy, about the county courthouse, and the way a thing like this would set fire to 100 small fires until men were driving slow past the end of his driveway with their windows down. He thought about what he knew of law. On land, finders weren't the same as they were on water. Property lines ran down into the dirt. Something buried on private ground could belong to the ground's owner, unless there was some other kind of claim, and claims were where talks got long and voices climbed. He didn't fear talk. He just didn't look for it. He drove into Coyote Bend instead with the locket in the inner pocket of his jacket, and a mind that had decided that knowing more before anyone else knew anything was the difference between shepherding and being dragged. The courthouse sat on the square with the post office and a plumbing supply where you could buy a specific gasket by first name. The records room smelled like old glue and a janitor's soap that had the word Pine on the label. The clerk behind the counter was Mr. Alton Reed, a man with a nose like a sparrow and a white shirt that stayed white even when wind brought red grit up the steps. "Morning," Sam said. He'd never used the man's first name. Men like Reed were their last name, and the job they did, and the way they had of working keys with an exactness that announced things would be found. "Morning," Reed said. "Flood took a bite out of you?" "South Field," Sam said. "Lost a terrace, found something else." Reed looked at him like he had and hadn't asked for more. "I'm not in a hurry to talk too much," Sam said. "Looking for plats and ownership before Pike, before my daddy. Anything back to when this was cut out of somebody else's place." Reed nodded slow, not a collusion nod, just a nod like men do when there is work with a goal. He brought him old plats. Sam unfolded maps that had been folded for longer than he'd been alive. Lines showed fences and creek runs that didn't run anymore. He learned things men knew once because they walked them instead of flew them on screens. The section that held his South Field had sat under the Whitlow homestead, 1860-something, then passed to a bank whose name was a man's name and not the thing banks call themselves now. Then to a speculator who never walked the land and sold it to a cattleman who did. He asked about the name Whitlow without asking. Reed tapped the index with a pencil and said, "Hiram Clay Whitlow. Signed 2 mortgages in 61 and 63, burned down in 65 with the rest of what was around it, war years." Sam lifted his hand to his inner pocket and let it fall. "Anybody look into what burned?" he asked. Reed shrugged with his mouth. "Everything burned," he said. "A lot of it didn't do it by accident. You looking for trouble, or the kind of answers that keep you out of it?" "Answers to keep me out," Sam said, which was true and not true both at once. He left with copy paper that had maps on it, and names he could say out loud in the truck like he was trying them on for taste. Hiram Clay Whitlow, HCW. He sat in the cab and looked over at the old cafe where a man named Delfino did eggs and hash with an art that didn't care what day it was. He wasn't hungry. He drove to the library instead, a low building with brick that had survived 3 hailstorms, and a librarian who had worked there 30 years and never once asked a man anything he didn't offer on his own. Mr. Decker looked up from a desk covered in stacks and lifted his chin. "Need a look at newspapers," Sam said. "Civil War years, cattle notices, anything from the Eastern papers that made it here in reprint." Decker stood without making a show of how long he'd been sitting and moved into the back and brought out bound volumes that were heavier than they looked. The pages were thin and smelled like dust that had given up. Sam turned with care. He didn't know exactly what he wanted to find, only that reading would either make the knot in his chest loosen or tie it into a sailor's fancy he'd never get undone. In the 3rd volume, he found a column that had swum all the way from New Orleans to here. It talked about funds diverted for the war effort, about couriers and wagons that went by night, about the routes men took to keep things from ships that were being watched by other ships. There were initials in a list, not names. HCW was there. There was a note in a hand that inserted into the typeset like a scribe leaning over a printer's shoulder. It said, "Strongbox delivered and planted." The date was August, 1864. He didn't look up for a long time. Men came and went. Decker brought him a glass of water and set it near his elbow with a noise that meant to be gentle and leave him the dignity of pretending he hadn't been startled by it. He found nothing else so clean, but he found enough to convince him that stories had legs longer than the men who told them. He thanked Decker, left the library into a wind that had decided the day wasn't going to warm, and drove home. There were fresh tire tracks on the Kalashi near his gate that weren't his. He set his jaw and didn't speed. The men who sped when they saw something they didn't like went home with dents or in trouble. He rolled slow past his house and slower toward the shed and watched boys. The door was shut and the lock was uncut. On the far side of the yard was a set of footprints that angled toward the fence where the mesquite started. He followed them to the fence line and saw where a man had climbed and then dropped toward the back pasture, where the creek ran sometimes if the winter had given more than it took. He knew the shape of the man he'd find attached to those tracks. Waylon Price liked to drive slow with the window down when things weren't his, and liked to say tough talk with the air of a man who'd never actually stood all the way to it. Sam went back to the house and made coffee. He took the locket from his pocket and laid it on the table. He turned it with a fingertip. To IH, my steadfast hand in the storm. He said the name out loud again, softly, like he was learning how to address someone who might or might not be listening. Isaac, he said. If I bend wrong, nudge me. 2 sparrows fought in the gutters. The coffee made a sound that meant it was ready for pouring and puzzle solving. He picked up the phone. When Harlan Ruiz answered, it was with his name, the way old friends do when they've kept track without needing much talk. Harlan had 30 years in the Coast Guard and a habit of listening until men thought they had nothing to say left, and then asking the one question that opened the whole thing up again. I've got something, Sam said. It's not a calf, and it's not a gearbox. Men with crowbars sniffing? Harlan asked. Men with crowbars sniffing, Sam said. Deputy? Harlan said. Cole Mercer, Sam said. He'll keep it quiet if he can. You'll need someone whose title says history, Harlan said. Not because you want the noise, but because when the noise comes, the right words are already written down by a man whose job is to say them. Know a man? Sam asked. Dr. Nathan Ellsworth at the university, Harlan said. Civil War logistics. Not the romance, roads, supply, where men put mules when they wanted other men not to find them. He's stubborn in the right way. Call him, Sam said. He called Mercer first. The deputy came out after dusk, no lights on. His car rolled to a stop far from the house. He shook Sam's hand with a grip like rope, tight enough to say, you're seen, loose enough to say, I'm not trying to make you feel small in your own yard. Sam took him to the shed and rolled the door and lifted the tarp. Mercer didn't whoop. He didn't say, my God. He let out a breath and did what smart men do when they see something that belongs to a time before they were alive. He respected the hush. You keep a list of who you told, Mercer said. Me, Ruiz, whoever he brings. That's it. You put game cameras on the gate and the creek and the shed corners. You keep that door pinned with your heaviest chain, and you don't open this again unless there's a witness. You want this to be yours. You need words in writing, and you need the right eyes to have looked. Waylon sniffed, Sam said. Waylon sniffs everything, Mercer said. Waylon thinks his life got cheated out of something and the world owes him. The world doesn't owe him. The world doesn't owe any of us. I'll drive by. Quiet. Harlan brought Ellsworth the next afternoon. The man had the tired energy of someone who loved difficult things and had spent a lot of years around people who preferred easy ones. He shook Sam's hand with both of his and asked for the story in a few sentences and then didn't interrupt. In the shed, Ellsworth bent over the coffin like a mechanic does an engine he's never seen before, but understands because engines are engines. He didn't touch the coins first. He touched the map tube. He ran his finger along the inside line of the lid where the scrollwork had been almost eaten away, and nodded once, like a man who's just confirmed the presence of an old friend. This wasn't a coffin for a body, he said. It's a coffin because strong boxes looked like this when craftsmen got paid enough to make them handsome. The initials will be the owner or the man who ordered it. HCW shows in papers downriver. That name attached to Rotes. Whitlow up here would make sense. The compass locket. He lifted it with the corner of a cloth, respectful like he was helping someone stand. A gift to a courier or navigator. To IH, it could be a merchant's man or a scout. My people told stories about an Isaac Holt, Sam said. Courier. New Roads men didn't. Ellsworth smiled the way a man smiles when the road in his head meets the one under his boots. Then this is not just an object, he said. This is a line. You give me 2 days in the stacks and I'll bring you back what I can anchor. No press, Sam said. No press yet, Ellsworth said. You let men like me do a few quiet things first, so when the noise starts, what's said is right. Waylon came back the third night. Sam heard the crunch of gravel like a man hears a zipper on a tent he's sleeping in, the first time he's out with a troop of boys he's supposed to look after. He stood up from the table without scraping the chair and took the flashlight and the old Navy knife that had been in his drawer for 20 years and walked out into air that had the bite of the last days of winter, pretending it still belonged. He didn't bother with the porch light. He kept to the side of the house and the shadow of the cottonwood and let his feet learn the damp spots and the dry, and when he turned the corner, he didn't speak because he'd already decided that the first sound needed to be a voice with everything necessary in it and nothing extra. "Step away," he said. There were 3 of them. Waylon and 2 men Sam didn't know who had faces that were used to nodding when the man they stood near talked big. A battery saw lay next to the shed lock. Waylon turned his head and set his jaw in a way that was supposed to read like, "I don't scare easy," but mostly read like, "I'm waiting to see if my mouth can write the check I brought my buddies here to cash." "What you think you're doing is a felony," Sam said. "If you get past that, what's inside is evidence, and the list of men who touched it starts with you 3. You ready to think for yourself for 5 seconds instead of as a pack?" "You found something in that field," Waylon said. "You don't get to keep it all to yourself." "I found it on my land," Sam said. "The law's not what your cousin told you behind the tire shop. Cole Mercer knows, and the state knows, and a man whose job it is to tell stories right knows. I'm not hiding it. I'm not selling it out the back of a truck either. You want to be the idiot who gets his name on the first page of the record as the reason all the wrong eyes come here?" The second man shifted. The third lifted his chin and then let it down again. Waylon spat into the dirt because men like Waylon think spitting makes the inside of a man look like the outside of one. "We're just talking," he said. "Then you've had your say," Sam said. "Drive away." Mercer's patrol car rolled without lights down the lane like a cue in a play that Waylon hadn't known he was in. The men climbed into their truck with the speed of men who want to move fast but don't want to look like they're moving fast. Gravel spit out from their tires, and then quiet came back the way it does when it's been waiting nearby. The next morning, Ellsworth called with his voice bright as if he'd slept in the stacks to be closer to what he needed. "Courier lines west," he said. "River diverted, wagons with false bottoms. A man called IH in a ledger with 3 ticks next to his mark, which usually meant trusted without question. Whitlow mortgaged to the hilt. If he buried a strongbox on land he meant to redeem or hide, then it never got redeemed and it never got found until now. You're not sitting on law, you're sitting on documentation with a lid on it." "What does that give us?" Sam said. "It gives you the right to say this belongs in preservation and that you are the discoverer," Ellsworth said. "The state antiquities people will say the rest in language that will keep the dogs off you as much as language can do that." "I don't want people here," Sam said. "You called the right men first already," Ellsworth said. "That says people will come to a museum instead." The men from the state came quiet. They wore plain jackets, and their eyes did the work, and their mouths did very little until they had their notes straight. They catalogued with cameras and long breaths, and the kind of murmurs that sound like church. They didn't touch the coins before they touched the paper. The map tube gave up 2 pages without crumbling all the way. Routes drawn with little notes like, "Creek cuts deep here," and "Knoll with lone oak," and a line at the bottom in a hand that had wanted to be neat and almost managed. "Strongbox delivered and planted, night fog, thunder far off." They made a temporary deal in his kitchen at the table where he had opened the locket. Ellsworth put plain words to it, and the man from the state with a trimmed beard and a voice that could deliver bad news without making enemies called the director in Austin and came back with the sentence they all knew had to be said in order to move the next thing. The items would be transferred for preservation. The discoverer would be named. An appraisal would be done. There would be a finder's share, because men who give things up to a public good shouldn't be punished for not giving them to the wind instead. It took weeks and phone calls and a hearing Sam didn't dress up for, because there's a way to say you respect a thing and you're still the same man in your boots. It ended with a number on paper that was bigger than anything he'd ever seen without someone else's name on it. He fixed the barn roof. He paid the note he'd been chipping on for 7 years in one quiet morning, and shook the banker's hand and nodded when the man said, "Nice to see a payoff that isn't attached to a sale sign." He put money where it would stand up and stay standing. A fund at the community college that would bear the name Isaac Holt and would send boys who didn't have the money to do it into trades with both hands empty and their heads full. A grant to a black cemetery on the other side of town, where the stones had leaned so long they'd taught the ground to lean with them. A check delivered without any fanfare to the Veterans Hall, where the coffee was bad and the stories weren't. He didn't move. He didn't buy a new truck. He got the water well serviced by a man named Levi and laughed once at the way the pump motor sounded like the grinder on the day he'd opened the lid and crossed from one life to another. In Austin, they arranged a display. He didn't think he'd go. Crowds and him had never been on easy terms. But Ellsworth called and said, "There are 2 kinds of pride. The kind that makes a man talk too loud, and the kind that keeps a man from showing up to the good he did because he thinks it's vain to stand near it. I need you to show up to the good you did." He went. He put on a shirt with a collar and a jacket that had hung in the closet so long the shoulders had memorized the hanger. The museum smelled like clean. The glass cases looked like they belonged to someone with the last name Museum. Coins sat in lights that gave them back to men who had never seen them, and would now talk about them like something they'd always known lived under the floor of their state. The locket lay open on black cloth. The compass rose was small as a thumbnail and perfect. The placard said what Ellsworth had said it should. Locket presented to I.H., believed to be Isaac Holt, courier and navigator in Confederate Texas, late 1864. The back inscription reads, "To I.H., my steadfast hand in the storm." The director, a man named Alan Bishop, whose tie knew things Sam did not, stood and said words to the gathered that didn't make Sam itch. He spoke like a man who liked that the things he guarded were now under light instead of tarp, and that the man who pulled them into that light could stand 10 feet away and not be changed into something else by it. Mr. Samuel Holt of Coyote Bend found these items in his field after a storm, he said. He did what we hope all of us would do if the past put its hand on our shoulder. He asked what was right instead of what was easy. He called not the loudest man, but the correct ones. And now, because of that, a story that was almost gone isn't. They clapped. Men clapped. Boys clapped. Ellsworth clapped. Harlan clapped with the flat hands of a man who has turned a wrench in a pitch he cannot hear but knows if it is right anyway. Sam nodded once and felt the locket in his pocket, though it wasn't there because it lived under glass now and would live there for men he would never meet. He swallowed, and for a second had to work at it. He'd told himself he wouldn't get wet in the eyes in front of men, because men have that thorn in them that says tears make you less. But there are other thorns that say holding back when a thing is right to feel is a kind of lying, and he'd had enough of lying, even the kind that looks like toughness. After, in the quiet the museum keeps between crowds, Ellsworth put a hand on his shoulder. "Isaac would have been proud you found him," he said. "I think he would have wanted the finding to mean something," Sam said. "It does," Ellsworth said. "Not because of the metal, because of the way you gave it away." Back home, men slowed their trucks less. Whalen kept to the far side of the square for a while, like a dog that's learned where the fence is hot. Mercer drove by twice a week and waved, the way men wave when the danger has stepped back, but hasn't left the county for good. Harlan came once a month and made coffee and told the kind of stories men tell when they know the boy opposite them isn't a boy anymore. Mr. Decker in the library kept aside 2 clippings for Sam that he thought he'd like to see and waited for Sam to come get them, which kept it like it had been. Men with their own dignity doing their own jobs without taking a bite out of someone else's. On the anniversary of the storm, Sam drove to the cemetery with a piece of paper in his pocket he'd folded into a square so tight the edges bit his thumb. Men stood there waiting. Mercer in his good hat, Ellsworth in a jacket that knew what the inside of a book smelled like. Harlan with his arms crossed, not in defiance, but in habit. Mr. Reed from the courthouse with a folder under his arm, like there might be a need to write something down, and he wasn't going to be the man who arrived unprepared. They'd set a stone. It wasn't big. It didn't need to be. The words were enough. Isaac Holt, courier, navigator, steadfast hand in the storm. The line below had more weight than the all of it because it wasn't written by a stranger but by the men standing there with him, brother to the living. Sam cleared his throat. He had thought he might write something, but written words look different on a page than they do out of a man's mouth, and he has always trusted the ones that arrive just when they're needed. "Thank you for not making noise," he said. The men smiled like they understood. They did. He put his palm on the stone. It was warm from sun that had come out halfway through the morning, like it had been deciding whether this was worth its trouble. He pressed his hand flat as if to say, "I'm here, and I know you are too." He drove home slow down the road with the pasture on either side and the fence that had 3 posts he meant to replace next week if nothing broke hard first. In the south field, he parked and got out and stood at the edge of the healed scar. Grass had taken the cut like it always does. There was still a line if you knew how to see lines, and men who have spent their lives outside are good at seeing lines the sky draws on the ground. He crouched and picked up a piece of clay that had dried into a curl, turned it in his fingers until it dusted back into itself, and looked up at the wind moving the top of the cottonwood. Somewhere under his boots, the world admired what they'd done with it, more than it cared whether they kept it or not. He felt the old quiet come back, not the kind he had before the storm, a different one, a quiet with a companion in it. When night came, he sat on the porch with a thermos and listened to the windmill tick. He thought of Whitlow in a house he'd lit with lamp oil on a night men rode by and certain things he'd built would end. He thought of men bickering under their breath about roots and creaks and wheels and the way a box can look like a coffin when a man needs to hide it where men won't dig. He thought of Isaac and how a man can be a compass for other men even when his needle doesn't swing anymore, and how the word steadfast isn't a word boys use very often, but is the right one when a storm lifts all the easy off the world. He didn't think of coins much. Coins belonged to other men now. He thought of the way the locket had felt in his palm before he put it on the black cloth. He closed his eyes and could feel the exact weight of it, the way things that matter find a way to stay. In the weeks that followed, he found himself talking out loud more in the shed and in the field and in the truck with the window down. Not big talks, not speeches men make when they want to hear their own sound come back off something. Just the names of things in case someone listening wanted to keep up. Post, he'd say, when he set one. Chain, when he threw one. North, when he turned out of the lane. He didn't feel foolish. He felt accompanied. Men in town started to use Isaac Holt as if he'd always been someone they knew. There was a boy at the college who came up to Sam at the feed store and shook his hand and said the scholarship would pay for the weld cert he couldn't have afforded otherwise, and that he would not make a mess of it. Sam told him there was no test to pass to be worthy of a turn of good. Just show up and don't put your hands in your pockets when it's time to work. The boy laughed and then didn't, and Sam liked him better for the not. Spring put green wherever it could get away with it. The wind warmed and brought grit with it, and the hinges on the back gate asked for oil and got it. The long heft of the day settled into hours that had their old shape back. Only sometimes now, when he walked past the shed or into the kitchen where the locket had been on the table that first night, he'd feel something in his chest shift. Not a pain. Not a hole. The opposite. A kind of weight like a hand on his shoulder that didn't push or pull, just reminded. He would set his palm there like he was checking a pocket that held something small and important, then get on with the next right thing. One afternoon at the end of May, a thunderhead built like a ship over the far trees and moved slow across the pasture, like a man who had no place else he had to be. The first drop hit the porch rail. The second found his wrist and rolled under his cuff and cooled his skin like a truth. He smiled without knowing he was going to. "Do what you came to do," he said, and went to roll the shed door down and check the dog's water and make sure the window over the sink was closed. The rain came on like a hand, and the wind got under the eaves and pushed, and the world did that thing it does in a real storm, where what is inside and what is outside learn exactly where each other stands. He watched the field go dark and then shine. When it let up, it stepped away with politeness. He walked out and put his boots in the new wet, the smell of clay so strong it was almost sweet. He knelt at the place where the storm a year ago had decided it had something to say. He put his fingers in the mud and came away with red that would not be fully gone until tomorrow. He rubbed it with his thumb and thought of men who'd walked this ground before him, and men who would walk it when he was gone. The field didn't belong to him the way paper said. He belonged to the field. He didn't feel small for that. He felt right-sized. On the porch later, he heard a truck slow on the road. It did not stop. It went on. He didn't watch to make sure. He trusted it. The windmill clicked. Somewhere, a coyote asked a question with a voice that sounded like a laugh and a cry both, and another coyote answered because no one wants to talk alone. He closed his eyes and listened. When he opened them, the stars were out in the kind of clean they wait for when they've been hiding too long. He turned the locket in his hand one more time before bed, though he didn't have it. He turned the space the locket had occupied inside him and felt it settle like a tractor finally on level ground after a mile of ruts. Steadfast, he said, trying the word again. It fit like a tool a man doesn't know he needs until he needs it, and then uses every day after like he was born to. When he slept, he dreamt of a compass whose needle was a man's name, and of a field that remembered every hand that had ever worked it, and of a storm that peeled back what didn't matter and left what did. In the morning, he rose with the day and put on his boots and went out and looked at what had been given to him again. The wind came from the north. He nodded toward it and went to work.